All right. Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. Thank you all for joining us. We hope you've had a great time at Mac Admins this year so far. Um, just the fact that you guys made it to the last day says a lot. So appreciate you guys for being here today. Our session for today will be on real-time continuous risk management for macOS. My name is Brandon. I am a principal engineer at Cumulos, where we enable cyber auditing and compliance for organizations. And you can find me on LinkedIn or via email. Today I'm joined by my co-speaker, Joe.
My name is Joe Becker, and I'm a Splunk engineer at Cumulus with a focus on audit and compliance in the gov sector. You can see my LinkedIn up there is Joseph D. Becker, and my email address is there if you ever want to reach out and or connect.
All right, so some high-level objectives for our session today. We're going to talk a bit about macOS risk management, some of the different strategies that organizations employ, as well as different tools in order to manage the risks that their macOS assets are exposed to. And then for our use cases today, we'll talk about system auditing, specifically capturing telemetry from your macOS assets in order to drive a number of security use cases and initiatives, such as threat detection in the context of incident management, as well as compliance automation. Additionally, we'll share with you guys some examples of how you can leverage all of this system telemetry in order to continuously monitor your macOS assets at scale. So our agenda for today, we'll be talking about auditing. What is auditing in the context of capturing system telemetry? Why you should audit macOS, how to audit macOS, what tools are available or at your disposal to get quickly started, and then we'll go over those use cases that we previously mentioned. Additionally, we'll take a look at system configuration auditing. So is anyone here familiar with the macOS Security Compliance Project? Yes? So I'm sure a lot of you have been doing a lot of great work there in order to assess the configuration posture of your devices. We'll show you how you can take that to the next level with continuous monitoring in order to get a holistic view of the configuration posture of your devices. Q&A. So we did leave some time at the end for Q&A, but as we go through these modules, feel free to raise your hand. We'll throw you the catch box, or if not, just ask your questions. We'll reiterate, and we'll be happy to discuss. All right? So why are we here today? If you can't read the screen too closely, these are all news headlines over the last few months indicating cyber attacks that have compromised the macOS platform. And so our goal here today is to enable all of our audience with different security controls or safeguards that you can employ in order to enhance your security monitoring for your devices. So with that in mind, a few examples of different infection vectors for macOS attacks. We're seeing a lot of software supply chain attacks. For example, the 3CX desktop zero-day vulnerabilities. Trojanized and pirated software can also install malware on your devices, as well as adware is another big one that has come to light based on security vendors' studies. So with that in mind, we're seeing an increase in malware compatibility, primarily through sophisticated threat actors that are employing advanced tactics and techniques, things like command and control server communications. And then, of course, you're always going to see the data exfiltration, to compromise your organizational resources. With that in mind, today we want to talk about risk management strategies that you can leverage within your org in order to enhance the security posture of your assets in a continuous manner rather than ad hoc once a week or once a month. We've broken it out into 3 different categories. So first one being endpoint security, endpoint management, and endpoint auditing. We're going to talk about what some of the different safeguards that your organization likely leverages for some of these. So for endpoint security, think all things malware, detection and remediation, so antivirus, endpoint detection and response, things like vulnerability scanning or host-based firewalls. On the endpoint management side, think of things like mobile device management platforms or endpoint protection platforms that allow you to pretty much configure and harden your system requirements in order to meet your access and security policies. And then some other tools or safeguards that you may employ include things like centralized directory services in order to conduct identity management, as well as data loss prevention tools. Our focus today will be on endpoint auditing, again, capturing that system telemetry to drive forward a few different security use cases, which we mentioned were incident management, primarily threat detection, and then compliance automation. So if your organization is subject to a number of different compliance mandates, how can we leverage technical data in real time from your macOS assets in order to demonstrate that you're compliant against all of the different controls that you're subject to? So why should I audit if I already have endpoint security solutions, endpoint management platforms in my organization? Well, auditing can serve as a layered safeguard, functioning as a detective control. It enables your organization to hold subjects accountable to any unauthorized or malicious activity, primarily when you're looking at things like insider threats that employ perhaps techniques that are not specifically aligned with a known threat or malware family. It also provides a record of system activity and allows you to prove or disprove culpability when an incident arises in your organization. And it can support some of those security use cases that we mentioned, such as threat detection and compliance automation. Additionally, with endpoint auditing, you can integrate it with other data sources from your devices, such as endpoint security, so you can enrich and correlate the telemetry that you're capturing, for example, against your authorized software packages that you manage via your MDM platform or your endpoint detection and response platform. With that in mind, let's talk a bit about system auditing, what it is, and how you guys can get started with it.
All right, I'll take system auditing. The question is, what is system auditing? Anybody? All right, I'll take the means by which a subject's actions are recorded and monitored for the purpose of holding the someone or something accountable. It enables organizations to detect malicious, unauthorized, or abnormal activities on a system. Typically, logging is used as the audit medium. With audit trail logs, organizations can recreate the history of an event, incident, intrusion, or system failure. Why audit macOS? Well, we want to maintain a record of all subject actions on a system so we can detect, respond, recover from an attack, detect anomalous activities indicative of an insider threat, detect misuse or exploitation of information and resources, support authorized investigations and inquiries. We want to identify system vulnerability, a malware, and assess the compliance state of our assets. Goal of employing vendor-agnostic detective security control, which is required by federal laws, executive orders, directives, policies, regulations, and standards. How to audit macOS? Well, we want to define a policy with the telemetry you want to capture. Configure system assets to generate audit trails, log system events and configurations, send to a centralized location like Splunk, which I work for, which I mentioned earlier, for example, so we can analyze the data to support security initiatives, investigations, and ultimately remediation. What is a system event? Somebody give me an example of a system event that we would want to capture.
Failed logins.
Boom, perfect. System event, any activity, one being failed logins, that occurs on a macOS asset, typically carried out by users and or processes. macOS and APIs. Categories like system events, file integrity, DNS, or IO registry, for example. And then the APIs like OpenBSM, which is now deprecated, that's been replaced with endpoint security. And as we go out with the old and in with the new, these APIs can be used to capture this data of like logs, metrics, and traces.
Yes, so the Endpoint Security API, right, as probably a lot of you are well aware of, is the new Apple-supported framework for pretty much capturing any security telemetry from your macOS devices, including authentication attempts, anything related to XProtect, file integrity, and way more. The goal is to enable everyone here today with some guidance on how you can leverage some open source tools in order to start capturing that telemetry in real time in order to drive forward some of those risk management initiatives. So some of the examples that we'll be going through today will be showing you how you can integrate with endpoint security. But it's important to know that as the project continues to grow, there are still some gaps that OpenBSM audit may be needed to cover, certain system calls and things of the like. That said, though, Apple is continuously driving new updates and audit event families to the public. So,
In reference to open source tools, there are open source tools at your disposal. ESLogger, for example, is packaged natively within macOS. We'll be using it as an example later on some of the slides. ESLogger provides detailed information on operating system activities that defenders can use to analyze applications dynamically and to engineer new detection methods.
has anyone used ESLogger here? Is that a, yep, okay. Yeah, it is a out-of-box program application that allows you to instantiate a client with the Endpoint Security API. So typically what security vendors do is, instantiate their clients directly with the API. But as an administrator, right, maybe you don't develop in Swift or Objective-C, right, which is what you need to program in to integrate with the API. Well, with ESLogger, you can use this CLI utility to define the audit event families that you want to capture and start streaming that data in real time, right? We'll touch a bit more here in a second on how you can actually scale that process and operationalize it.
A strong audit policy. It is defensible, it's implementable, provides security value, enhances security posture, aligns with security frameworks. It's collect what is important and is attainable, and aligns with security frameworks like NIST SB 853 or FedRAMP audit controls, for example. Provide security value and enable real-time monitoring and alerting.
Yeah, so with a strong audit policy, you want to make sure that the actual telemetry that you outline or want to capture is actually possible, right? Things like data loss prevention or data movement, there's not necessarily a specific audit family or audit category through these APIs that say, hey, here's some data loss movement occurring, right? In this case, we look for things that are indicators of that activity, such as processes and things of the like. And then enhance the security posture again. Does this telemetry actually enable you to drive forward risk management initiatives against your assets? Because what we don't want is just to collect this telemetry and have it sit there without driving much insights. You want to enable data-driven decision-making as well as situational awareness within your organization.
And with that, synthesizing an audit policy. Synthesizing an audit policy. At the org level, that means at which you identify necessary telemetry in order to continuously assess the security posture of your macOS devices. There are a number of resources out there to support you with this effort. Today we'll be using guidance from the Executive Office of Management and Budget, who has issued a memorandum that outlines logging requirements across various technologies, with one of them being macOS. The memorandum was issued as a result of the SolarWinds incident. I don't know if anybody is familiar with that. And its goal is to enable security investigations before, during, and after an attack has occurred. Logging categories. These are different categories defined within the OMB M2131 memorandum for macOS. Anywhere from file access, network communications, user access to OS components and applications.
And I'll just note that The memorandum is great for getting you started in crafting or putting together an audit policy for your macOS systems, but you as a system owner or system administrator will probably have way more context, specifically at the organizational level, of the different activities that you want to capture within your enterprise or org, right? So it's important to know that this can get you started on your journey to endpoint telemetry, but it's by no means the finish line. So.
User access, OS components and applications. Audit log access, system access, log off, remote terminal access, file and object, who has access. System performance and operational characteristics. You got resource utilization, system events, service status changes. In terms of like resource utilization, look for spikes in CPU. Now that could be software that's already on your system, or it could be something that's installed on your system that shouldn't be there.
If you have a potentially unwanted program or a Trojanized application, it's possible that it may use a lot of your system resources, right? Things like crypto miners, right? You want to have the ability to identify these different things within your org, right? And possibly investigate if needed. So these types of system performance events can steer you in the right direction to ensure that you're employing accountability across your assets.
System configurations, looking for audit logs being cleared, user or group management changes, schedule task changes. Maybe really would focus on insider threats.
Yeah, so like any sensitive paths here, and you could even kind of throw under this MSCP, which is like at a point in time, what is the configuration posture of my assets, right? And where does it align with my established baselines or security standards?
Data exfiltration, transfer data to external media or remote hosts. Obviously, it's based on the policy of your organization. And network communications. We're looking for established network communications, listening network port and IP addresses, active network communications with other hosts. And command line interface. We want to monitor the CLI activity related to user activity that is indicative to these processes and warrants an investigation. System logs, system reports, user application logs.
If you're capturing, for example, like audit D logs, right, and you have an insider threat that is looking to employ defense evasion mechanisms, right, they might be removing the most recent audit logs on the macOS system or something like that, right? That's an example of where this data would come invaluable. And you would probably look at things like process activity related to the relative or absolute paths of these different logs.
And then firmware, version, created date, installed date. It's not just to know what version, but to monitor and send alert where firmware is on your system that has been either compromised or has a 0-day vulnerability. Security use cases. All right, so we talked about different logging categories. Now as an organization, how do we use this data to support security initiatives? Well, a few cases include incident management. Specifically, your organization will be able to support threat detection requirements. And system compliance, your organization will be able to continually assess technical security controls and system configuration. Threat detection and response, and compliant automation. An incident that we would track is any event that has a negative effect on the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of an organization's assets. A security incident would be the result of attack or malicious or intentional actions on the part of the users. Primary goal of incident management is to minimize the impact on the organization. So incident management, it's where we want to audit. So we want to log, we want to monitor, we want to detect, alert, and then respond.
And then you could see in that cyclical phase, right, the green circle auditing obviously is the endpoint telemetry that we're using to drive all of those detection efforts, right? if your organization employs like a really nice endpoint security tool, like a endpoint detection and response or something like that, that platform likely does something like this for you already, right? With something like this, we'll get into it in a bit on how you can actually complement and enhance that system telemetry with things like alerts from your antivirus or your EDRs.
And then system compliance, same thing. It's one we have assess, monitor, document, and then obviously we want to remediate.
The goal in this case is to demonstrate how, using again that endpoint telemetry, we can demonstrate that we are compliant against our different established controls, typically technical controls, which is what we'll use in our examples today. All right, guys, so we've talked a bit about what auditing is, how it works, different tools, why you should use it. Before I move on, does anyone have any questions or any remarks on kind of what we've talked about a bit so far? Okay. So, if I'm painting a picture here, we've talked about all of this endpoint telemetry from our systems. We talked about the use cases that we can support in order to maintain risk at an acceptable level for our macOS assets. But how do we actually enable that effort or those different efforts and use cases in a scalable and operational fashion, right? Anyone have any suggestions? Well, we do it through telemetry monitoring, detecting, and alerting. So when I talk about monitoring, I'm talking about the ability to continuously assess the state of your macOS system, whether it's via traces, logs, which is our big focus today, or metrics. Our value proposition today is that this is typically accomplished with a log management platform. We like Splunk, but we understand that it's, perhaps it has a cost associated today, right? Or it has a cost associated to it, which is why your organization may get started with different open source alternatives that are free of cost. Well, free to use, not free to support, but we'll touch on that in a bit. And then when we talk about detection and alerting over these system logs, we refer to your organization's ability to identify anomalous, unauthorized, or malicious activity. Generally, you want to alert. You don't want to have to sit in front of a dashboard for 28 hours a day, right, looking for an indicator of compromise. So you want to alert when, for example, assets are not compliant, or malicious activity is detected across your environment, or any anomalous system performance. And those are just some of the few, right? When you start getting into the compliance use cases, right, you may have reached a threshold where the risk threshold of your macOS assets deem additional attention. Perhaps your system configurations have gone out of compliance based on the baselines that you have employed. So that's when you would want to be alerted in order to remediate in a timely fashion. Though, back to the log management platforms, we want to pretty much aggregate in a centralized fashion all of this system telemetry so that we can enable those capabilities that we're talking about, which is monitoring the data, searching over the data with detections that we identify meet our organizational requirements, and then alerting in a timely fashion. A few open source alternatives that your organization can explore or get started with include elk stacks, so that stands for Elastic, Logstash, Kibana, Grafana, and Loki, as well as Graylog. Any questions before we move on to our first security use case using endpoint telemetry? Take it away, Jim.
Yep. Let's talk about threat detection. Threat detection is one of our security use cases within incident management, where we can detect insider threats across various domains, including admin access and escalation or application. So an adversary may exercise a number of techniques indicative of an attack. Here's a list of some initial categories to monitor. For example, admin access and escalation. We're looking at audit, administrative, and root logins, as well as privilege escalations, and data movement, which I mentioned before, and it audits movement of data to remote hosts and external devices.
All right, so now let's talk about some of these different threat categories that we just mentioned, some of the organizational security objectives that you'll want to keep in top of mind, some monitoring capabilities, right? With your platform, with your intelligence platform, what do you want to have the ability to report on or continuously assess, right? Of course, like we mentioned, these are things to get you started, right? The use cases and requirements across different organizations are going to vary. So, security objectives for admin access and escalation as far as threat detection goes. You want to have the ability to audit and monitor any privileged accounts and processes in order to ensure that they haven't been compromised or misused. Typically, any privileged accounts or processes are targeted by adversaries as they have access and permissions to sensitive data and capabilities. And so, if one of those accounts or processes are exploited, an adversary may have the ability to escalate their attacks. So, as far as monitoring capabilities go, you want to have the ability to identify privilege escalation attempts, as well as any privileged authentications, and then any privileged system events or processes that are running on your assets, right? Generally speaking, if you've identified a process or software that shouldn't have privilege capabilities, that generally warrants an investigation. So, data of interest, we're looking at, again, those system events, operating system logs, whatever you want to call it. You can use the logd unified data stream. Anyone use that right now across our org to capture different system activity? Yeah, right. Very cool. It allows you to pretty much, it's kind of, in a way, similar to a log management platform because you have different sub-processes across your system sending to the same data stream. The caveat here, though, is that generally, if you don't want to capture a high volume of data that perhaps is not high fidelity for your use case, then you need to define a search criteria for what it is that you're looking for. In our case today, we're going to advocate for endpoint security, specifically in the context of capturing initial admin access and escalation activity. Why? Because it gives us those audit categories out of box. We don't need to define any search parameters or criteria. We just define the audit families that we want to capture and then aggregate them to, say, a log on the file system, right? So for this specific use case, we're looking at things from the endpoint security API, including the authentication, process, SU, and pseudo families. So in practice, in its most atomic form, what would that look like, right? Well, this right here is an example CLI process that you could, for example, run on your dev box, where you would stream in real time all of this telemetry as it occurs. So we're using the ESLogger application, which again is an out-of-box program that macOS packages, and we're capturing the authentication, process execution, SU, and pseudo activity, and redirecting that data stream to a log. In a production environment with a log management platform, I may collect this data in real time and send it to my centralized location, right, where I can aggregate it across all of my different systems and search over it in real time. A few notes about ESLogger. It, by design, on behalf of the Endpoint Security API, it must run as a privileged process with full disk access. So if you're looking to, say, capture some of these different audit categories from your system continuously, you might run it as a process, create a launchd job to establish persistence, and then pick up those logs, send them to a centralized location where you can conduct intelligence over them. So, a few different reports or things that you can continuously monitor that will give you an initial good view of this specific category of threat activity. So you might be looking at things like any top users by privileged executions, right? Maybe there is a anomalous or outlying count of activity that a specific user is executed in the environment. Maybe they're not developers, maybe they're just standard end users. Why are they running all of these weird things, right? Recent privileged events. So from an investigation perspective, this allows you to use an event-driven timeline to operationally identify what's happening right now in our environment as far as any privileged events go. So again, things like authentication attempts and process execution and things of the like. And then we've outlined a few different examples up there as well. So that's our first threat detection category. Let's talk about our second one. Any questions so far on admin access and escalation before I move on to the next one? Second one, file and object. So think of anything file integrity related on the host file system. So file creations, deletions, access, metadata or permission changes, right? At the organizational level, you want to have the ability to monitor file access activity in order to ensure that users and processes are accessing only authorized files and directories. And then as far as monitoring capabilities go, you want to have the ability to monitor any file ownership, permission, or status changes. Has it been deleted? Has it been created? And then you want to also identify user or processes attempting these files. As far as where you can collect this activity from, again, we're going with endpoint security all the way. They've continued to release event categories related to file integrity that can support a lot of your use cases and initiatives. So file access, file creation, file deletion. The user, if an end user is accessing my audit control file, why is that happening? Should they be doing that, right? Is that a safeguard that we've defined at the organizational level to control telemetry from our devices? If so, why are they messing around with it, right? And then in practice with ES Logger, again, if you wanted to check this out, how the data comes in a streaming fashion. In this case, we're instantiating a client and looking for the data categories of file creation, deletion, and access, and redirecting that stream to a log. So, different things to report on or to monitor that can get you started. Any file permission changes or ownership changes, as well as deletions by the source user or identity, as well as any anomalous file changes, right? Is there anything in Etsy security that's being modified? Why? Is it by our MDM account or is it by a standard user account, right? These are the kind of things that you want to have a grasp on in a continuous fashion. And then finally, we're going to talk a bit about the application category or process application software. And then at a high level, you want to have the ability to identify any anomalous, unauthorized, or malicious processes running on your devices. Typically, unauthorized software doesn't necessarily have to be, but can be vulnerable and exploited for attacks or leveraged to exfiltrate data on your devices. For this application, the good thing about capturing this endpoint telemetry and operationalizing it with a log management platform is that you can employ as much situational awareness as you want. So you may want to get a list of authorized software for your macOS devices, right? Well, I may integrate with my mobile device management platform or my EDR in order to get that list of authorized software and correlate it with this process activity, right? So to pretty much pull the needle out of the haystack, I may search only for processes that are not in my authorized list, right? As far as monitoring capabilities go, you want to, at a general level, monitor in a continuous fashion application execution throughout the environment. And then if you have the ability to capture program hashes, those are really good for security intelligence. So data of interest, where can we get it from? Endpoint security API, process execution, event class. It is a high volume data source, so in a production environment, I probably wouldn't use ES Logger, as this is probably better suited for lower volume data sources. But there are a lot of, there is an open source supported tool, OS Query, that allows you to capture that telemetry from that API for process execution and file integrity activity. So OS Query is a compiled application that has been designed and created to scale for these high volume data sources. So what do we want to monitor for application execution? So really any application execution across our macOS fleet, such as any software that we are not accounting for, or any off-profile applications, or any applications that we want to closely monitor. Maybe we recently deployed a software package for a new tool, and so we want to assess its performance across our environment. This would be a good use case for it. Any anomalous application initializations, or perhaps any processes that have not been signed by a developer or organization, right? And then we included the macOS Endpoint Security API. That takes you directly to the table of different audit categories that you can capture. All right, so we talked a bit about our threat detection use case in the context of monitoring and detecting. Let's talk a bit about some alerting requirements and some of the things that as an organization you would want to strive for in order to ensure that you are detecting threats in a timely fashion, whether those are known malware attacks or perhaps insider threat activity.
We talked about our log management platforms, but once we collect all these logs, about setting alerts, so we would, and not having it as a manual process, so you are monitoring in real time. But security objectives, we want to efficiently alert on threats and indicators of compromise with optimal time to detection, because that enhances the time to response. Time to detection is of high priority with a threat detection platform. When you know about it, you can fix it. When an insider threat team is notified of alerts, time to identification and time to response are both significantly improved, which is further securing the enterprise as a whole. Alerts of interest, as you see, can be anywhere from downloading to local devices, as I mentioned before, malware installation, as Brendan has spoke on, unauthorized local device access, or unauthorized privileged access. Alerting on thresholds, it should support data correlation across various sources, provide context, and lastly, satisfy incident management requirements. Alert on these threats should be done in a timely manner. Preferably operate over an event-driven layer versus a polling system or an interval. I mean, you're trying to identify these threats as they're occurring, and provide context. When an alert fires, you want a description of the alert event, what was impacted, what assets and identities, tactics accomplished via technique execution, timestamps, technical evidence. How is threat alerting accomplished? Well, it might be, AAV, log, antivirus, log management platforms, or SIMs. We generally use, or your organization can use a number of different tools to alert on threats, like antivirus or EDR or log management platforms, like Splunk, like I mentioned before. There's a lot of them out there, and SIMs, your security information and event management. Threat detection risks for macOS. These links, this slide deck will be available at the end of the conference. And if this is something that you want to get to these links, you'll be able to access them from there. So no need to copy it down at this time. But from here, we talked about auditing. We're going to slide into compliance.
So before we get to that, actually, these are great resources that just introduce you to the threat landscape of macOS. A lot of open source research development for different adversary tactics. So check these out when you get a chance and see what different correlations and detection rules are out there, right? It's pretty much a guideline for saying, hey, you have the tool to continuously monitor this data and alert on it. Here's are some of the detections that you can start employing that go beyond known malware families, right? Which is what something like an endpoint security tool will focus on. And then before we transition to our next segment, I did just want to show you, ladies and gentlemen, a quick example of pretty much what a continuous threat detection platform would look like across those different threat categories that we talked about, such as admin access and escalation, process activity, etc. Right? So I'm going to end the show very quickly. I'm going to transition to my browser. Yes, we can see it? Okay, great. So if we look closely here, specifically with this log management platform, I am monitoring, again, that application family for different process execution across my macOS fleet. In this case, I have like my one VM running macOS, right? But you can start to see different metrics, right, that we talked about. For example, assets that are executing applications in user folders or perhaps hidden folders, right? Those are generally indicators that you want to look deeper into. And then you can see here from a operational perspective, I have the ability to see any anomalous application initializations, right? So we talked about the 3CX zero-day software supply chain attack. Oh, wait, it looks like the update agent process ran on my device. That's interesting. What's going on there? If I expand on that, maybe I have the ability to identify what that hash is for that device or not, right? Oh, look at that. If it's a 0-day, it might be a few hours until your endpoint security vendor integrates those mitigation strategies into their suite. With this, you have the ability, as soon as you know, to go over there, see, oh, crap, this hash matches. I've got 2 assets that are compromised. We need to contain these assets and isolate them from our network. And then from an operational perspective, right, having the ability to see on an event-driven fashion what different processes are occurring across our environment. So let's get back to our slides. And before I turn it over to our second use case, does anyone have any questions on threat detection as a whole in your from a security use case using endpoint telemetry? Any remarks or ideas? All right, so we're going to turn it over to our second security use case using endpoint telemetry, and that is to support cyber compliance for your macOS systems or assets. So we're going to talk about why compliance, talk about risk management, what it is, how organizations can employ it or exercise it across their organizations, such as with the risk management framework. We'll talk about compliance assessments at their most granular or atomic level, which is with controls that are generally pulled from authoritative sources or institutions that create what we call control libraries. We'll talk a bit about the continuous monitoring phase of the risk management framework and how, with a platform to aggregate all of your data, you could automate a lot of the assessment process, primarily for some of those technical controls for which you can capture evidence from your devices. And then we'll wrap it up with a small slide on secure configuration guidance with the NIST Special Publication 800-219, which is also known as the macOS Security Compliance Project. All right, so why compliance? Why should organizations exercise compliance? Well, typically, or at times, organizations are subject to laws and regulations. They need to support system, process, and practice alignment with regulatory bodies, industry standards, and sometimes or at times contractual obligations. Also, these organizations typically need the ability to continuously assess and ensure that their systems are compliant against their security and privacy requirements. Compliance enables or allows organizations to maintain the security and privacy of their information systems by applying or implementing security controls that ensure that the risk that their system is susceptible to is at an acceptable level. Typically, organizations exercise compliance through risk management practices. So what is risk management? It is the means by which organizations employ different tactics to minimize risk across their organization to an acceptable level. There's no such thing as complete risk mitigation, right? But the goal for organizations that are exercising compliance is to meet it to a level that is acceptable across their org for various systems. Risk management typically requires the iterative assessment of the system's compliance, and it generally employs controls that vary across different categories. So you may have administrative controls, physical controls, and technical controls. Our focus today will be on technical controls and how we can drive and comply with different technical controls for our macOS system using all of that endpoint telemetry that we've captured. So things like account management on the system, media protection, audit and accountability, incident response, those types of things. Typically, we exercise risk management with frameworks. So there's a lot of them out there. Some are geared towards different industries or organizations based on your organizational needs or mission. Today we'll be talking about the NIST Risk Management Framework, which is a framework created by NIST, the authoritative source, and it was developed for federal agencies to exercise their compliance needs. Typically, private organizations exercise or leverage risk management frameworks that are perhaps the level to entry is not as high, such as the NIST cybersecurity framework. So if your organization has some compliance mandates or needs that maybe you're just getting started on, the cybersecurity framework is usually an initial good guide. But with something like the NIST Risk Management Framework, which we'll cover a bit on, organizations can pretty much follow all of its cyclical phases to demonstrate compliance with different things like CMMC, SOC 2 reporting, CIS, and way more. So let's talk a bit about the NIST Risk Management Framework, what it is, and then a few different attributes. It's a guideline for monitoring, assessing, and resolving risk. It dictates how systems must be architected, secured, and monitored. And it provides a process to integrate and maintain security, privacy, and supply chain risk management activities into the system development lifecycle. It provides a risk-based approach to control selection and specification. The NIST Risk Management Framework consists of 6 phases that should be continuously performed throughout the life of the organization and the system. In this case, your system, let's say, would be your macOS presence. It's intended as a process to identify and respond to threats and incidents, but above it all, to manage risk. And typically exercising not specifically the NIST Risk Management Framework, but a risk management framework or a risk management framework in general will help your organization establish a security infrastructure and an ongoing improvement of your environment's security posture and systems. So, what are the different phases that make up this framework? We categorize, we select, we implement, we assess, we authorize, and then we continuously monitor, which is a lot of our value proposition will be supported through endpoint telemetry. So let's just quickly go over some of these different phases. The categorize phase will allow organizations to categorize systems and information processed, stored, and transmitted based on a loss and risk impact analysis. Some of the different outcomes from this phase include a documentation of your system's characteristics, as well as a completion of your system security categorization. So think different stakeholders, assets, resources that make up our macOS system. The select phase is when an organization selects an initial set of controls to protect the system based on the security and privacy requirements. Some outcomes here include your control baselines. So what are the specific controls that we want to ensure that our system is compliant against, right? And then you also define a continuous monitoring strategy here, right? What specific controls, perhaps technical, perhaps administrative or physical, should we as an organization continuously assess for our macOS system? The implement phase is when you implement your controls and document how they are deployed and used within the system. And then in the assess phase, you'll have the ability to determine if such security controls were implemented correctly, if they're operating as intended, and if they're producing the desired outcomes with respect to satisfying the security and privacy requirements. Typically, to employ accountability across your organization, you'll have an authorizing official authorize your system based on an acceptable level of risk to your organizational operations, assets, and individuals based on the assessed data. And then finally, the monitor phase is a phase where you continuously monitor the system as well as its implemented controls. So generally speaking, technical controls in the context of you leveraging endpoint telemetry are great for continuously assessing the security posture of your assets where applicable. So your responsibilities as a system administrator and system owner may vary. So as a system owner, you may be in charge of categorizing your system, its assets and resources, as well as its stakeholders. Whereas as a system administrator, you may be in charge of actually implementing the controls and safeguards that have been outlined in the security and privacy plan of your macOS. So you may be in charge of implementing your EDR solution or capturing endpoint telemetry, right, to satisfy with some of those different controls. Any questions so far? So now that we have a framework for managing risk across our macOS system, how do we manage the security and privacy requirements at a granular level? Well, I mentioned the term a lot in the last few minutes. We do it with control libraries, which generally come from authoritative institutions such as NIST, CIS. And so some of the popular ones include NIST 800-53, which contains a broad category of controls. So think audit and accountability, media protection, incident response, configuration management, and many more. With that in mind, we know that system security and privacy is managed via controls. So what is a control? Well, it's a safeguard, or really anything that removes or reduces a vulnerability or protects against one or more identified threats to your organization. It could be any process, policy, device, or practice, or other conditions or actions which manage risk. A control typically spans across various security and privacy domains, like I mentioned, such as incident response, media protection, identification and authentication, and things of the like. And like I mentioned, controls can be technical, administrative, or physical. So with that, let's talk a bit about the last phase of the risk management framework, which is continuous system monitoring.
Which is basically the meat of what we've been talking about. Hopefully everyone is still with us. Riveting stuff at times, I know. But continuous monitoring. Let's talk about the goal of no more outdated evidence, no more manual processes. We want to leverage the macOS system telemetry with an automated passing, failing, or applicable technical controls, as Brandon had mentioned, and supported by real-time technical evidence. By utilizing the log management platforms that we have mentioned, as we have mentioned on the previous slides, to get you to that continuously monitoring phase. A continuous monitoring system, it's definitely going to be on an event-based approach versus a timed or a polling. You're looking for it in real time to maintain ongoing situational awareness about the security and privacy of the system to support risk management decisions. Continuous system monitoring outcomes, ongoing assessments of control effectiveness, output of continuous monitoring activities, analyzed and responded to, process and place to report security and privacy posture management, and ongoing authorizations conducted using results of continuous monitoring activities. What are continuous system monitoring outcomes? Well, the purpose is to maintain ongoing situational awareness about the security and privacy posture of the system and organization, and to support that risk management decisions. Continuous system monitoring task, what we want, ongoing assessments, ongoing risk response, and from there, security, privacy, and reporting. Again, we're looking at an event-driven approach versus a time-driven approach. And from there, we can move on to security configuration guidelines.
All right, so secure configuration guidance using MSCP. So what is the NIST Special Publication 800-219? It is pretty much secure configuration guidance for macOS using the open source project macOS Security Compliance Project. It allows an organization to secure and assess macOS system configurations in an automated fashion, and it leverages security baselines that typically align with different security standards such as NIST, DSA-STIG, CIS, in order to establish what your assets should be complying against. It's typically atomic in nature, so it's made up of rules across various categories for different configuration domains such as authentication, auditing, system preferences, iCloud, and a few others. So with that in mind, I'm sure a lot of you have had the opportunity to leverage this project in order to assess your assets in your environment that perhaps you administrate or own. And so what I'm going to demonstrate now is how you could continuously monitor and report over this information in order to make risk-based decisions against your macOS system. All right, guys, so here pretty much at a high level what I'm doing, or what my organization is doing, is we've implemented a number of different controls to our macOS system, and we're leveraging a lot of endpoint telemetry data to support whether we are complying with the requirements of those controls or not, right? And so for our use case today, I want to look at the configuration management control, which is pertaining to configuration settings, and I pretty much want to assess what the posture of my environment currently looks like, right? So if you have used MSCP in the past, and I apologize, this is probably super tiny. Yeah, if you have used MSCP in the past, you know that it's made up of different atomic rules that contain different system checks. And so you can see here that I actually have a number of different rules that I am assessing my system against and reporting on in a continuous fashion in real time to give me a situational awareness of the risk posture of my assets, right? Again, based on a event-driven timeline of when these scans are occurring. So, for example, you can see here that these rules have run on Elon's and Tim's and Brandon's MacBook, and we're seeing a lot of passing. And so if I look at the compliance posture based on my established baseline, I can see that 85% passing, which is pretty good, and then 14% failing, which means that there is likely some remediation opportunities there, right? So if I click on my results, I'm taken to some other dashboard, whatever, right? It's not, the focus here isn't, what it's doing, but like opportunities for monitoring, I suppose. So we can see here that I'm 85 compliant, 14% failing. And so maybe I just want to look for a rule that I failed, which is audit failure, halt recommended, failed 84 times. I'm actually using that specific system check to demonstrate compliance with my audit 5 control. And so maybe I just want to learn some additional information about it, right? What is that specific rule? What is the runtime check that is executing on my assets in order to assess perhaps why it's failing and remediation guidance, right? So you can see here, I get some rule description, the runtime check that is actually occurring on my asset in order to assess what that specific system setting is, and then the expected result or value, which is an integer of 1, right? Then I actually can report on what are some of my affected assets based on the scans that occurred, right? In my case, my organization is scanning my assets on a daily basis. So I'll have the ability to report on the last day and any changes that have occurred. All to that, that was an example that your organization could employ in order to continuously monitor the security posture, the security configuration posture of your macOS devices, rather than saying, let me run this once a week, go run a few Excel pivot tables to see where I stand. With something like that, you would have the ability to, at any point in time, assess where your devices stand. And with that, I transition to our closing thoughts. So quick recap on what we discussed today, right? We talked a bit about risk management for macOS, what the current landscape looks like, and then talked a bit about our value proposition, which is to conduct endpoint auditing in order to support a number of different security initiatives, such as incident management, specifically in the context of threat detection, and then compliance automation using things like MSCP. So with that, I open the floor to any questions, and thank you all for joining us today. Everyone still awake? Good.
Any questions? Anything with this? What? Oh yeah, well I'll throw the box. But or your personal use cases, or just apply to your current.
Anyone capturing their macOS logs in general?
Yes.
Yeah? Any cool use cases?
I'm gonna throw them in the box. So we can.
I'll hand you this. I'm not a good thrower, so.
I'm not a good guy.
Yeah, that was great actually.
I don't have any particular interesting use cases, mainly because I don't think we've caught anything yet as far as massive vulnerabilities or 0 days or anything like that. My question is, where is the sort of break point for whether it's efficiency or efficiencies of scale, or at what point does it make sense to do more of the real-time sort of the kind of dashboards and things that you're showing versus the more manual stuff? Is it you're monitoring 10 Macs or 100 Macs or 1,000 Macs? Is there a good point where you're like, if you're doing this with 1,000 machines across multiple networks,
Yeah.
You're doing it wrong. You need to be doing this instead. Where are the sort of those logical breakpoints?
Yeah, I'll give my consultant response, which is it depends on your organization's needs, right? If you're satisfying all of your security requirements as far as administrating your macOS devices with manual processes, then perhaps maybe you don't require this level of intelligence, right? But what it does do at a certain point is open the floor or the room for unlimited monitoring use cases, right? But that said, right, there is some dependencies there, right? You need to employ and support a platform that can aggregate, parse. Somebody has to sustain those dashboards, right? Create them, get with the stakeholders, and so the value proposition has to make sense around, do we want to roll this out for 10 macOS devices, or do we have 13,000 macOS hosts that we just need to have a good grasp on where they stand? So it just depends.
Or even if you have, say, 5,000 Windows devices and you're doing something
Yeah.
for them and you have, 50 or 100 Macs.
So I'll tell you this, the good thing about employing, a technology agnostic data platform is that if you're doing threat detection if you want to start up doing threat detection using this telemetry, it doesn't discriminate Windows or Linux, right? So if you have 5,000 Windows assets, guess what? You can do the same efforts for Windows and macOS. So that's a nice pro there, actually.
I got it.
Great question.
It was.
In reference to your question, like how many, I know that I am privy to that we came across an incident where if you weren't at a certain level of compliance, you weren't insurable. So if you pay somebody so that you would pay out, a threat or a compromise to some set organization, if you are compliant, then, your bill is $10,000
Sure.
a retainer versus $100,000 for your stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's just the industry that I happen to be in, but I thought that was really interesting when it was placed on a cost. I know in the past, my social security number was compromised a long time ago, and then they paid to watch my credit for X amount of years, which was funny because I was the one that actually disposed of that hardware. So I laughed because I said, no, those servers were in my desk drawer, there, right? And they were scuzzy, so you weren't pulling them back. They were basically disposed of. But that could be a use case, and I don't know if that's even being addressed in some of your instances. I haven't heard it mentioned this week about that. If there's any, like insurance companies saying that if you're so compliant,
Yep.
we'll guarantee you on a data loss or.
And that's really interesting because I just had a conversation earlier this week with someone from higher education where their institution was running into that. They weren't cyber compliant, and their insurance coverage was like not going to happen if they didn't get those efforts underway. So, yeah, definitely. Great context.
All right, so I always get yelled at by my network guy whenever I turn the log fire hose on, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
Yes, you know what I mean, right?
Yes.
You guys alluded to that, right? It's like you got to get really the intricate and actionable stuff in the system and not just like
Anything and everything.
Not just turn on the fire hose.
Yes.
And I get it. You mentioned like those 4 logs right at the beginning, like sudo, su, authentication, and process. I think is what you guys mentioned.
Yep.
Are there some low-hanging fruits that I could, any sources that I could say like, hey, these are the things that aren't going to turn the fire hose on, but they're like the essentials.
So specifically for admin access and escalation, I think that was the threat family that we were looking at. I would do sudo, and what was the other one? I know it was process, and then authentication, I think.
Yes.
I would do authentication, su, and sudo. If you want to do process activity, I would recommend you go with something like OS Query, because it's been battle tested for high volume data sources for that specific API data source. So process execution and file integrity, those are two that will blow up your, bloat your network. So, yeah,
Totally.
you definitely want a more mature strategy for capturing those.
Okay, and then one other question here. You were showing us right at the end there. Were you just pulling the P list that that software was writing in?
So,
Were you actually writing
yes, the logs,
Yeah,
the
you
logs,
just-
yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
great question.
Hey, hello. Just to add something to the process logging, there is a solution that it's called Santa by Google, because it integrates with the endpoint security framework, and you can write whitelisting rules. So the thing is that if you know, well, you can turn it. It has two modes. So it has the monitor mode and the lockdown mode. So you start with the monitor mode, you get like a lot of allow unknown because you haven't identified any software. So you get a lot of events, but you can deploy it on a percentage of your fleet to just gather like the kind of information about what is going on. And you start writing your rules. The rules can target the team ID, they can target the certificate, and then when there is a rule that allows the software, then you don't get the event anymore. So you can quiet down the firewalls, then you deploy it on more of your fleet, and then you get only the unknown. And then you should write a rule about it. You should decide like if you want it or if you don't want it.
Yeah.
And then there's a progressive way of doing it without opening the gates of, because the ESLog is like, yeah, it's massive. I run like full inventory assets for software and get like 10,000 apps on the Mac easily.
Yep.
If you want all the events, it's. I mean, I've done that because I'm from Central, so we do that.
Yeah.
But, it's a lot. But I think there's a strategy with Santa, and you get high definition events,
Nice.
and you can really twig it on. And of course, if you use Central, you can even do sharding and stuff like that.
And what's the project called again? Santa?
Santa, Google Santa.
Google Santa?
Oh yeah, and it's bulletproof. I mean,
Okay.
we run it on 200,000 max.
Wow, right on. I gotta look into that.
Do.
Great. Great question, guys.
Anybody else? Well, in closing, again, I appreciate everybody being here. It was a great week. I met some wonderful people throughout the week. We had some great laughs, and I appreciate you all coming this afternoon.
If you guys are comfortable, leave us some session feedback and make it home safe. Thanks.
Cheers, everybody.